Morena Tato, can you all hear me? Is this working? Trying again, better? Cool. Morena Tato, ko Tasman Tokwingwa, and I'm a researcher at Maangi Taio, the Bioeconomy Science Institute. And as Sonny mentioned, this talk is really about shining a spotlight on the Braided River Bird Count database. So many of you will be aware that, or even have done a Braided River bird survey, but just in case, it involves a line of surveyors walking downstream and counting all birds seen as they pass them, and generally that's done in sections. And that's been done for quite a while now, starting off with the New Zealand Wildlife Service, then turned into DOC. By now it's also loads of cool community groups doing surveys, and of course regional councils. And recently those data have been made publicly available for Canterbury on their online Canterbury Maps resource. And on the right you can see the very cool funky interface where you can even go online and download data. Miles Burford, who's the architect behind the database, tells me there's now data for Canterbury from 67 rivers, spanning 6 decades, and over 918 surveys, and that includes repeat surveys within a year. So I think the Mackenzie Basin takes it all. The Tasman River has been surveyed over 70 times within a year, so there's a record to beat for everybody. Quickly taking a step back, so why do we bother? Why monitor? And the first bit, or what I want to walk you through today is really what those data can tell us. And first of all, understanding. So through those data, we are able to understand the species richness in those places, the species distribution and their habitat association, but also over time, we can build up a picture of population trajectories, and that's where really those repeat count sections come in, that repeated survey method. And last, of course, it's about documenting outcomes, especially if there's been management. And as you've already seen in awesome videos and also through the talk by Jen and Sam, Braided Rivers, they concentrate a huge diversity of habitat at small spatial scale. And through that, not just across all fauna, but even within birds and ducks in Canterbury, you end up with more than 80 bird species in these places. And they associate with specific microhabitats. So there's about 8 different feeding gills that these species group into, whether they are wanting to feed in deep pools or walking along the shallows, pecking away at little invertebrates. There's 8 endemic species, 23 threatened or at-risk species, and 11 species that are categorized as highly mobile species in the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity. A highly mobile species is a threatened species that moves across jurisdictions, either throughout its life cycle or annually. And this national policy statement has given statutory obligations to the council to look after mobile fauna and their habitats. So for that, it's also important to know where these mobile fauna are. And I'm going to dive into it and show you different examples of what we can pull out of those surveys. So first off, this is an example from the Waio-Ufa surveys. The Waio-Ufa it's been surveyed in blocks of 3 years on, and then some period where there's no surveys to focus on other rivers. And these are data from the last survey period from 2022 to 2024. They survey go from sort of Hanmer Springs at the start, that survey section 1, all the way up to C, survey section 15. And you can see those survey sections again on the x-axis down here. And what I'm showing you is density, so the number of birds per square kilometre, so that we can compare across sections. I'm not showing you actually all the species because it wouldn't have fitted on the slides. And I've broadly grouped species into their feeding gills, so shallow water waders, deep water waders, and aerial gulls and terns is what I've picked out. And generally, just to quickly highlight what we can see is that, for example, banded dotterel right at the top or South Highland pied oyster catcher, they're fairly evenly distributed across the river. So there's no single part of the river that necessarily appeals to them more than other places. But then unsurprisingly, for example, for the colony nesting species, there's definitely some spots where we are in a darker blue color, so indicating higher density, that are really more the sort of hotspots areas. And so, for example, when it comes to thinking about gravel extraction or so on, some of these surveys can already indicate a little bit of like, oh, where are there places where birds really like it? Although actually what we are finding is that particularly for some species, they like it everywhere across the river. Next, if we take a step back across the region, I'm showing you 14 stretches that are roughly grouped into rivers on the plains, shown sort of in yellow on the map, and then rivers in the upland basins. And these are surveys, well, all surveys grouped together between 2020 and 2024. And again, I'm showing you density. And all of those species that I've picked out are highly mobile species. And across the region, what we can see is that for some species, they're fairly widespread. So banded dotterel, black-billed gull, black-fronted tern, the plains as well as the upland basins are actually important for them, or they occur there at relatively similar densities. For ryebill, it looks like definitely the upland basins are a bit more their sort of stronghold compared to the plains. And then in this lower group, there's some of those highly mobile species that are much more associated with estuaries, and so pied shag, red-billed gull, white-fronted terns. So again, it's in terms of thinking about planning and management, it's needing to take a sort of whole catchment perspective and looking at upland rivers as well as the sort of plains rivers with their river mouths and those specific habitats that they provide. I'm wanting to take another step even further back and look at the community as a whole and how those communities associate with different environmental drivers. And it's the same data set from rivers on the plains and rivers in upland basins, but this time over a much longer time period from 1979 to 2024. And I'm going to show you an ordination diagram, which basically just distills that complex community information down into 2 dimensions, and we're mapping communities that are similar to each other, close to each other in space. So what you can see here is the dots in green are communities on the plains in different reaches, and in yellow are those on upland basins. And the plains nicely grouped together in the sort of top right, the upland basin rivers in the sort of more, top left and bottom right. So they fall out and have slightly different communities. And when we look at associated environmental drivers, so weed encroachment within the riverbed, surrounding intensive land use, so in a buffer around 2 kilometers around each counting stretch, mean river flow, flooding frequency, and predator management intensity, what we can see is that the plains are really associated with those intensive land use and the weed encroachment, and the higher predator management intensity is where the upland basin rivers fall out in. If we look at which species are distinctive of these communities, I'm showing you in the same ordination space the species that are found within that community, and they're color-coded by whether the species is not threatened in blue, whether it's native and threatened in light red, or if it's endemic and threatened. So endemic only occurs in New Zealand. And we can see that the plains communities are much more dominated by the not threatened species, whereas the upland basin reaches are dominated by our endemic and threatened species. Moving on to the guiding action, so that's where really the repeat and the long time frame comes in, because we can track what populations do over time. Colin O'Donnell started looking at black-fronted terns and looked wider than Canterbury, so this is also taking other areas in the South Island into account. And across 29 rivers, he found that there were significant declines in 8 of those, mostly associated with rivers that had relatively low flow. A few years later, Colin also looked at banded dotterel and looked at both Braided River bird count data, again wider than Canterbury, and winter count data, but that was only for New Zealand. And what you can see, both data sets suggested a decline, but suggested a slightly different severity of decline. Recently, I also used the Braided River bird dataset on Torea, on South Island pied oystercatcher, and I pulled, again, different data sources together. So Braided River bird counts, wintering counts done by Birds New Zealand, productivity data, and also marked resite data to build a population model, and connecting all of those different data sets together to also understand, amongst other things, their annual cycle better. And what we found in terms of population trajectory is unfortunately not really great news, that the population is declining at 1.8% per annum, and that is actually warranting a higher threat classification. Recently, I've also explored with some colleagues at the Bioeconomy Science Institute of how to communicate those trends for different species at different spatial scales easily. And so this is building on the New Zealand Garden Bird Survey. And basically what we are looking at is trying to categorize whether a decline is sort of what the severity of the decline, and yeah, whether it's a trend of concern if we're in the reds, or whether it's a trend of interest if we're in the blues. And the different, what we're also assessing how certain we are with that trend, and that comes out in how strong you will see the circles in a minute. So across the Canterbury region, I've just pulled out again 5 species that we've trialed this analysis approach on, where we are counting also for the survey effort across time and across the region. What you can see is that in some ways over the past 10 years, it's good news that at least for Ryebill, banded dotterel and South Island pied oystercatcher, we're not detecting neither a strong decline nor a strong increase, so they're stable. For black-fronted tern, this is actually quite exciting. We're detecting an increase for black-billed gull, unfortunately a slow decrease. And with these trends, we're fairly certain when we dive into it a bit more into detail. As you can see, some of the trends become a bit fainter because we're less certain of whether we're actually seeing an incline or a decrease. The other thing that I want to quickly point out here is that it's a bit of a mixed bag. So it's not really that we can pick out that one region is doing really well across all species, or that one species is doing necessarily super well, although it looks actually best for black-fronted terns, which is great news in that case. Diving down into a specific reach, this is again data from the Waio-Ufa surveys and providing a scorecard. The data is similar, presented again of having whether we are in the reds or whether we are in the blues. This time evidence strength is shown by the dots on the right hand here, and the more black dots you have, the stronger or the more certain we are about the direction of that trend. And again, unfortunately, the news aren't that great for the Waio-Ufa. So for South Island pied oystercatcher, black-fronted tern, and banded dotterel, we're in the orange and yellow. The great thing, though, is that with repeat surveys, we can keep on tracking of how we're doing over time, and ideally shift these trends into the blue direction. Last, that's about documenting outcomes, and this is again building on that idea of having a bit of a scorecard, and it's pretty new work at the moment. It's very hot off the press. We're assessed how different predator control projects we're tracking, and for the moment we looked at whether there were how the trends looked like 5 years before any predator management started, and how that trend changed 5 years after the management began. I've picked out 4 species, so the solitary nesting species, Ribel, South Island Pied Oystercatcher, and then black-fronted terns and black-billed gulls. In terms of projects, again, I'm showing you just a subset. So we've got the Upper Ashburton, the Tasman, the Upper Rakitata, Upper Oho, and the Lower Ashley. And basically, what you want to look at is comparing the before column for each project with the after column that's highlighted in red. And the good news is that across these projects, we always find an improved trend for each species after predator control began. So even though in the Upper Oho, we're still in the reds, at least the trend is less severe than it was before predator control began. One thing to note here is that, of course, all of these predator control projects had different start dates, and so we're comparing different time periods, and these species are mobile, so there's more work to be done to delve into to also understand if we are comparing other rivers where there was no management at the same time, what were those trends looking like. The other aspect is, of course, many of you will know these projects differ widely in the kind of predator control they do and the intensity that they do them. And for example, some projects are more geared towards an individual species, such as the Upper Oho, which also is often referred to as Tern Island. So it's great that it has benefited somewhat Ribel, but it was never geared towards necessarily turning things around for Ribel there. The other aspect I wanted to quickly highlight is that actually it's looking that predator control seems to do quite well for colony nesting species, which I find quite exciting. It is to note, though, again, that in some cases we are less certain about really that trend direction. So if you compare that, this circle is much fainter compared to the before trend. So there's more delving into these results to be done. And what I hope you take away from this talk today is that there's really wide uses for these monitoring data and for the database. So we not just need the surveys, but also that infrastructure behind it, being able to pull out data and use them is really valuable. As we keep on adding data, the value just increases exponentially. And that is because it enables to actually have an evidence base to inform the decision making, but also provides a basis to actually report on biodiversity goals. So I really hope that I can show the different uses, but also I want to mention it's all work in progress. So I think we've only just really scratched the surface of what we can learn from these counts. And last, I wanted to show you somebody that is really artistically talented drew into the insets of these old reports on the Waitaki, and I really liked it, of that much more artistic expression of what Braided Rivers look like. And thank you to the many people that have been involved in various ways into this work and motivating some of the kind of analyses.